good news is that there is more and more awareness of the need to incorporate climate change as a factor into urban planning in the future of cities. Some cities, Bogota, obviously in Buenos Aires, both for legal reasons, for social movement reasons, have been paying more and more attention to the need to incorporate the natural environment and conservation into their plans. Perhaps one could say that they're not doing too much or enough, given the imminent threats of climate change, or even some of the day-to-day threats that many of our cities face, landslides, drought, rain. In Lima, unfortunately, we have cases of landslides, and those phenomena, especially in kind of the more vulnerable parts of the cities, aren't necessarily addressed or contemplated and planned. They should be. Some of the things to pay attention to are how national legislation around environmental protection and mitigation are affecting land use plans and municipal development plans, and the extent to which citizens and courts are requiring cities to pay attention and incorporate those variables into their plans. There's a fallacy that there's the institutional and the people-centered are two separate things. They are both one and the same. What we have the challenge is how and why we separate them on our own, and that's a matter of how engaged the citizenry is in their own institutions, and also how open institutions are to having public participation or public scrutiny in their work. But in theory, and in practice in many cities, you look to Europe, the institutions and the institutional practices reflect the interest of the community and have mechanisms for allowing the community to participate, interrogate, and change the institutions. The challenge is to look at in places where we assume that the institution and the technocracy and the technocrats are a world wholly apart from the citizenry. It happens, but it's not those things that can change. Those relationship changes, and they usually change when the citizenry, civil society, and social movements demand and pinpoint where the public servants and the public institutions aren't serving the public. We have a lot of work to do on that front in Latin America. The city statute is, for many good reasons, a reference, has been celebrated and should be celebrated as a very important declaration of the importance of cities and the importance of urban residents and people's right to participate and live in a dignified urban space and have access to the resources and benefits of the cities and urban development. And a fundamental component of that is this concept of the social function of land, which emphasizes that land is both first and foremost a public good, a public resource. We can't live without it. But it's also we live in a system where it's also a private good. But when you emphasize that there's a social function to land, you declare and you establish a concept and a precedent for the management of all land to be done in a way that serves the public good, and that there's not one private interest that surpasses that. The citizenry or social movements or neighborhood movements really need to also assume that they demand or assume that they have a role or a place at the table when their decisions are being made, and that's where we have to pay attention to when and how public authorities, governments, define certain projects and priorities. If it's just government institutions or public authorities meeting with a particular set of private interests at the expense of other actors, we start seeing, we know that problems can arise, and we need to pay attention to those. Well, the concept of deliberate improvisation came out of my analysis of the way that the Chilean government back in the 1990s was able to implement its infrastructure concession plan, whereby the government planned and defined a list of private infrastructure investments, primarily highways at the time that I was studying this. how they defined it and how they implemented it, and within that, I discovered that the paradox that one of the ways that they secured private participation in the concession systems was to very carefully plan for the interest and carefully plan the rollout of infrastructures and the contracts behind the concessions in ways that met the interests of the private sector in terms of stability, transparency of contracts, and so forth. What was missing there, though, was there was a deliberate decision to focus on making sure that the contracts were rolled out well, to then ensure that the projects would be funded and developed at the expense of planning for the impacts and having space for public voice in the development of these projects. And the thought there was that the state would have the power to improvise if and when issues around the development and rollout of these projects came out. And so the concept of deliberate improvisation is really deliberately deciding to improvise on some aspects of planning while on the other hand, very carefully planning for some other aspects. And this kind of relates to the issue of the public-private sector participation in planning.